The gaslight streets. The rain fell in slow, heavy drops, turning the narrow cobblestone streets into dark, gleaming rivers under the glow of the gas lamps. Every puddle reflected a piece of London's restless night, a flash of carriage wheels, a boot heel splashing, the red flicker of a pub sign swaying in the wind. The air was thick with coal smoke, damp wool, and the sour smell of unwashed bodies. Somewhere in the distance, the whistle of a night watchman cut through the sound of dripping eaves. Clara Hughes stood in the shadows, her back pressed to the brick wall of a crumbling alleyway. She clutched her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling the icy water creep down the back of her neck. She was 22, though the hollow in her cheeks and the faint lines around her eyes made her look closer to 30. Her hair, once the warm brown of chestnut shells, was now dull and tangled, pinned hastily to keep it from falling into her face. To a stranger, she might seem just another girl waiting for a lover, but Clara knew better, and so did every man who glanced her way. The streets were her living. She did not choose them. They chose her. The night hunger became louder than pride. It had not always been this way. Clara could still recall the gentle sound of scissors snipping through fabric. In her mother's sewing room, the hum of her mother's voice as she worked by candlelight. Their home above the bakery in Camden had been small but filled with warmth. The smell of fresh bread would float up the narrow staircase, and in winter, the bakery's ovens kept their rooms warm enough to make the cold outside feel far away. Her mother had taught her how to sew straight lines, how to match threads, how to save scraps of cloth for mending. Clara had dreamed of becoming a dressmaker, a real one, with her own shop and customers who smiled when they left with a gown she had made. But dreams were fragile things in a city like London. When the fever came, it took her mother in less than a week. Clara remembered sitting by the bedside, holding her mother's hand, whispering that everything would be fine, even as her own voice trembled. By the third day, her mother no longer answered, her breaths shallow and labored. The local doctor came once, left a bottle of bitter medicine, and never returned. The landlord came soon after the funeral. He was a large man with a slicked-back head of hair and a mouth that always seemed to be chewing something. Clara had the week's rent in coins, but not the next, and he made it clear what she could offer instead. She refused, packed her few belongings in a cloth bundle, and left. At first, she tried to find honest work. She went from shop to shop asking for sewing jobs, cleaning jobs, anything at all. But there were too many women like her and too few jobs. After a week of cold nights and empty stomachs, she began sleeping in doorways, her bundle clutched to her chest, her body aching from the cold. It was on one of those nights that Bess found her. Bess was older, her face lined but painted with bright rouge, her laugh carrying down the street like a bell. She offered Clara a warm meal, a dry bed, and said nothing about the price until the morning. By then, Clara was too tired, too hungry, and too far gone to argue. Now, years later, Clara stood in the same streets where she had once walked in fear, waiting for the next man who would hand her coins without looking her in the eyes. A carriage passed, the wheels splashing filthy water onto her skirt. She didn't flinch. The night was only just beginning, and she had to earn enough before sunrise to keep her place in the lodging house. The man who owned it, a narrow-eyed brute named Calloway, didn't care how the money came, only that it did. Her first customer appeared soon after, a man in a fine wool coat, the kind she once dreamed of making with her mother. His hat was pulled low, his breath heavy with brandy. He did not greet her, did not ask her name. He pressed 2 shillings into her hand, turned toward the stairwell of a nearby lodging, and expected her to follow. She did. But as her feet climbed the creaking stairs, her mind drifted back to Camden, to the warm light of the sewing room, to the smell of bread and the feel of her mother's hand resting on hers. She clung to that memory like a scrap of fabric saved. For mending, small, fragile, but just enough to hold together the fraying edges of her heart. Outside, the rain kept falling, washing the streets for the morning. But inside, in the dimly lit rooms of London's underbelly, there was no such cleansing. The Count's offer. The rain had eased to a thin mist, but the streets were still slick, catching the reflection of gas lamps in fractured golden pools. Clara stepped back into the alley, tucking the coins from her first customer deep into the hidden pocket she'd sewn into her skirt. She had learned long ago that keeping her earnings close to her body was safer than trusting anyone else. Not even the other girls in the lodging house. Hunger made thieves of them all. The night air was colder now, sharp against her damp skin. She pulled the shawl tighter, her eyes scanning the street out of habit. Every sound mattered in this part of London. The shuffle of boots behind you, the way a shadow moved under a lamp, the sudden silence in a street that had been loud moments before, all of it could mean danger. From the corner came a deep chuckle, followed by the metallic clink of coins. A man stepped forward, tall and broad-shouldered, with a black hat pulled low over his brow. His coat was cut from fine cloth, the kind only the wealthy could afford, and his gloves looked new. Even in the dim light, Clara could see the glint of a gold ring on his finger. "You," he said softly, as though he'd been looking for her. She froze. Men rarely approached her with such directness. They usually pretended not to notice her until they had decided to make their move. This one seemed different. "You've been here long?" he asked, his voice smooth but with a faint foreign lilt she couldn't place. "Long enough," she replied cautiously, keeping her tone flat. She had learned that showing too much interest could be dangerous. Showing too little could be too. Stepped closer, and Clara caught the faint scent of expensive cologne, the kind that masked the smell of cigars. His eyes, dark and unreadable, studied her as though weighing something in his mind. "I'm looking for someone who can be discreet," he said at last. "Someone who knows how to keep her mouth shut, no matter what she sees or hears." Clara's stomach tightened. This was not the usual language of a man looking for a few hours' pleasure. This sounded like business, the kind that could mean money. Or trouble. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said carefully, though part of her was curious. The man smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth lifting without warmth. "I think you do." He slipped his hand into his coat and brought out a small leather pouch. The sound of coins inside was unmistakable. He loosened the strings just enough for her to see the dull gleam of sovereigns. More money than she usually saw in a month. Maybe 2. Her heart thudded. "What's the job?" He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You come with me tonight. You serve drinks, pour wine, keep the guests entertained, but most importantly, you hear nothing. You speak of nothing. Do you understand?" Clara hesitated. Men like this did not walk the streets for no reason. If he needed a woman who could keep quiet, there was something behind it, something important, something dangerous. "Why?" "Me?" she asked before she could stop herself. His smile deepened, though it still didn't reach his eyes. "Because you look like a woman with nothing left to lose." For a moment the words stung, but she didn't argue, because in a way, he was right. She glanced down the street. 2 other girls stood under a lamp, their painted smiles fixed, as a group of men approached. The wind carried the faint echo of drunken laughter from a nearby pub. Somewhere in the shadows, she could feel Calloway's presence. The landlord always kept an eye on his girls, making sure they earned. The man extended his gloved hand toward her. "Shall we?" Clara's mind raced. If she said no, she'd spend the night as she always did, counting coins, avoiding the worst of the men, and trying not to think about how cold her bed would be when she returned. If she said yes, she risked stepping into something that could change her life or end it. but the weight of the rain on her shoulders, the ache in her bones, and the memory of her mother's hands sewing straight seams in warm lamplight all pushed her forward. Maybe this was her chance. If not at escape, then at something different. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, and without another word, he led her toward a waiting carriage. The driver, a thin man in a bowler hat, tipped his head but said nothing as they climbed in. The interior smelled faintly of leather and tobacco. The door shut with a solid thud, and moments later, the wheels began to roll. Through the rain-speckled window, Clara watched the familiar streets fall away. The gas lamps became fewer, the noise of drunken voices faded, and soon they were moving through quieter, wider streets lined with tall houses. She could feel her pulse in her throat. "Where are we going?" she asked. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at her, really looked at her, as though still deciding something. Then he said, "To a place where the night never ends." The House of Velvet Shadows. The carriage rattled through the wet streets, the steady clop of the horses' hooves echoing in the misty air. Clara sat with her hands folded in her lap, fingers worrying the frayed edge of her shawl. She tried to keep her expression calm, but inside, her heart was restless. London at night was a creature of two faces. One side was the familiar darkness of Whitechapel, narrow lanes crowded with the poor, the desperate, and the dangerous. The other side, which the carriage now entered, was wide and quiet, its homes lit with warm lamplight and heavy curtains drawn against the cold. It was the London of men who owned ships, factories, and banks, men whose names appeared in newspapers and whose hands never touched grime. The man across from her had not spoken since they left the alley. The pouch of coins still sat in his coat pocket, and its weight seemed to fill the air between them. Clara's thoughts returned again and again to that gold. How long could it feed her? Could it buy her a small room, a place without Calloway's watchful eyes? Could it be a way out? The carriage slowed, then turned down a narrow lane lined with bare winter trees. At the end stood a building unlike any Clara had ever seen. It rose 3 stories high, its brick walls half covered in climbing ivy, and its windows glowed with soft golden light. The front steps were lit by 2 tall lamps, their flames steady despite the wind. The man stepped out first, then offered his hand. "Welcome," he said quietly, "to the House of Velvet Shadows." Clara hesitated. The name sounded like something out of a whispered story, the kind told among the girls in the lodging house about places where rich men played dangerous games. Inside, the air was warm, scented with roses and something darker, maybe brandy, maybe perfume. A thick carpet muffled her steps as they moved through a grand hallway lined with oil paintings of women whose eyes seemed to follow her. The glow came from dozens of wall sconces, each holding a small glass-shielded flame. They entered a large room where men and women lounged on velvet chairs. The men were dressed in fine suits, some with cigars, others with glasses of amber liquid. The women wore gowns that shimmered in the low light, their hair pinned with jewels. Laughter and low conversation filled the space, and though no one looked directly at her, Clara felt the weight of their glances. A tall woman in a deep burgundy dress approached. She had hair the color of black silk and eyes that missed nothing. "This is her?" she asked the man beside Clara. "Yes," he replied. "She'll do." The woman smiled, but it was not the kind of smile that warmed you. "Follow me." Clara obeyed, passing through a pair of heavy curtains into another room. Here, the light was dimmer, the air heavier. A long table stood in the center, covered in crystal glasses and silver trays of food. Men sat at the table talking in hushed tones. At the far end, a man in a black suit with a silver-tipped cane watched her. "This," the woman in burgundy said, is where you work tonight. You pour drinks, you smile when spoken to, and you do not, under any circumstances, leave this room unless told." Clara nodded, though unease curled in her stomach. The evening unfolded slowly. She moved among the men, filling glasses with wine, offering plates of pastries and small cuts of meat. They spoke of ships crossing oceans, of laws being bent, of fortunes being made in ways that made Clara's skin prickle. More than once, she caught a word or a name that she knew should be forgotten the moment she heard it. Halfway through the night, the man with the silver-tipped cane called her over. "What is your name, girl?" "Clara, sir," she replied softly. "Clara," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it on his tongue. "You have the eyes of someone who listens, more than she speaks. Keep it that way, and you may be rewarded." His words unsettled her. In a world like this, rewards could be as dangerous as punishments. By the time the clock struck midnight, the air in the room felt heavy with secrets. Clara's back ached from standing, and her mind felt full of things she did not want to know. And yet, she couldn't deny it. Part of her was drawn to the strange power in the room. These men spoke as though they owned the city. Perhaps they did. When the night finally ended, the man who had brought her there pressed the leather pouch into her hands. "You did well," he said. "Remember, nothing you saw or heard tonight leaves this house." The coins were heavy, the gold warm from his hand. Clara clutched the pouch, knowing it was both a gift and a chain. As the carriage took her back through the sleeping city, she stared out the window at the dark streets, wondering what she had stepped into and whether she would be able to step out again. Whispers in the fog. The fog had rolled in thick by the time the carriage returned to Whitechapel. It moved like a living thing, swallowing the gaslight until the lamps glowed as faint, pale orbs in the distance. The air was damp and cold enough to settle into the bones, and every step seemed to echo too loudly in the stillness. Clara stepped down from the carriage with the leather pouch clutched tightly in her hand. The man who had brought her to the House of Velvet Shadows said nothing more, only tipped his hat before the door slammed and the wheels carried him away into the mist. For a moment, she simply stood there, breathing in the silence. The gold weighed heavy in her palm, not just the weight of the coins, but the weight of what they meant. She had been inside a place she was never meant to see. She had heard things that could ruin men if repeated. She had walked among the powerful, if only for a night, and she knew enough to be afraid. As she made her way toward the lodging house, the familiar stink of Whitechapel returned. Coal smoke, rotting vegetables, unwashed bodies. Somewhere a baby cried, and somewhere else a drunk shouted into the night. Clara kept her head down, her steps quick. When she reached the corner near Calloway's building, a figure stepped from the shadows. Her breath caught, and she instinctively slid the pouch into her skirt's hidden pocket. "Late night for you, Clara," said a voice she knew well. It was Jimmy Pike, a thin, sharp-faced man who worked for Calloway. He had the kind of grin that never reached his eyes, and those eyes were fixed on her now, searching. "Working," she replied simply. He took a step closer, his breath sour with gin. "Working where?" "I didn't see you out on your usual corner." Clara forced a shrug. "Different streets? More coins there tonight?" Jimmy's gaze flicked down to her skirt. "Calloway says you pay him by morning. You know what happens? If you don't." "I know," she said, keeping her voice steady. He stared at her for a moment longer, then smirked. "See you in the morning, then." As he disappeared back into the shadows, Clara's pulse quickened. Jimmy was like a dog for Calloway, always sniffing around for scraps of information, always ready to sink his teeth into weakness. If he suspected she was hiding something, he wouldn't let it go. Inside the lodging house, the air was thick with the smell of damp clothes and candle smoke. Women lounged in the common room, some half asleep, others laughing too loudly. Clara slipped past them and climbed the narrow stairs to her small room under the eaves. She locked the door, then pulled out the pouch and spilled its contents onto the bed. Gold sovereigns, more than she had ever held at once. She ran her fingers over them, the metal cold and smooth. For a moment she let herself imagine a room of her own far from Whitechapel, a shop with her name above the door, a life without the constant fear of men like Calloway. But the memory of the House of Velvet Shadows crept back in, the men at the table, the names spoken in low voices, the man with the silver-tipped cane telling her she would be rewarded if she kept quiet. And then she remembered something else, a name she had overheard, a name she recognized from the newspapers, a man connected to the police, the courts, and Parliament. If he had been there, and if others knew she had seen him, a knock at the door startled her. "Clara?" It was Bess's voice, low and urgent. She swept the coins back into the pouch and hid it under the loose floorboard by her bed before unlocking the door. Bess stepped inside, her eyes darting to the corners as though checking for unseen ears. "Where were you tonight?" she whispered. Clara frowned. "Why?" "Because there's talk," Bess said. "Jimmy's been asking about you. And 2 men came by earlier, not from here, well-dressed, asking questions." Cold spread through Clara's chest. "What kind of questions?" Bess hesitated. "About whether you'd been anywhere special." They stared at each other, the weight of the silence between them pressing hard. "You need to be careful," Bess said finally. "Men like that don't like witnesses." Clara's hands trembled as she locked the door behind her friend. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass of her window, curling and shifting as though it were alive. Somewhere beyond it, she knew, were eyes watching. And in that moment, Clara understood. She had not left the House of Velvet Shadows behind. It had followed her home. The man in the black coat the next morning began with a gray, heavy sky pressing over Whitechapel like a lid. The fog from the night before had not lifted. Instead, it had thickened, crawling low over the cobblestones. Clara woke to the muffled sounds of the street below, the rumble of wagon wheels, the sharp cries of fishmongers, the cough of someone with a chest full of soot. She had not slept much. Every creak of the building had made her sit up, listening. In her dreams, velvet curtains swayed and men's voices whispered things she couldn't quite understand. By mid-morning, she decided she needed to get the gold out of her room. If Jimmy or Calloway searched the place, she'd lose it all. She tucked the pouch deep into the folds of her skirt and pulled on her shawl. When she stepped out into the street, the air felt damp against her skin, heavy with the smell of coal smoke and stale beer. She kept her head down, moving quickly toward the market, where she planned to find a money changer she trusted. But halfway there, she felt it, that prickling sensation along the back of her neck. Someone was watching her. She glanced over her shoulder. The street was busy enough, women carrying baskets, a boy chasing a dog, a cart piled high with turnips. But among them was a figure that stood out. A man in a black coat, tall and broad-shouldered, walking at a steady pace behind her. At first, she told herself it was nothing, but when she turned down a side street toward the market, he turned too. When she stopped to look in the grimy window of a pawn shop, he stopped at the corner, her pulse quickened. She started walking faster. The man kept pace. Clara ducked into a narrow alley between 2 brick buildings, the smell of rotting vegetables and damp wood hitting her nose. She moved, quickly, her boots splashing in shallow puddles, and emerged onto another street. She glanced back and froze. He was there. Now closer. His hat brim was pulled low, shadowing his face, but she could see the glint of something in his eyes. A focus. a coldness that made her skin crawl. Clara didn't run. Not yet. Running in these streets could be a mistake. It drew attention, and the wrong kind of attention could get you caught faster than standing still. She turned toward the market instead, slipping into the thick of the crowd. The noise there was overwhelming. Vendors shouting, coins clinking, the clatter of cartwheels over uneven stones. She moved between stalls selling bruised apples, cheap tinware, and bolts of cloth. The man followed. When she reached a fishmonger's stall, she caught the vendor's eye, a wiry old man with a scar along his jaw who had known her mother. "Clara?" he said in surprise. "Back room," she whispered urgently. Without another word, he lifted the stall's side flap and she slipped inside. The air was damp and smelled of fish, but it was hidden from the street. Through a crack in the canvas, she saw the man in the black coat stop, scanning the crowd. He looked left, then right, then slowly moved on. She stayed hidden until the market noise swallowed his footsteps completely. When she stepped out again, the fishmonger gave her a wary look. "You've got trouble, girl?" "Not if I can help it," she said, forcing a smile. But trouble was exactly what she had. That evening, as the lamps were lit and the fog thickened again, Clara returned to the lodging house. The gold was still in her pocket, but now it felt heavier than ever. She thought of the man in the black coat and the way his gaze had locked onto her. She thought of the house of velvet shadows and the names she had overheard. And she thought of Bess's warning. Men like that don't like witnesses. That night, she dreamt of footsteps following her through endless fog. When she turned, the man in the black coat stood there, but this time, he wasn't alone. The threat in the night. The night was quieter than usual in Whitechapel, as though the fog itself had swallowed the sound, even the pubs, normally spilling, over with shouts and drunken laughter, seemed muted. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, fully dressed, the pouch of gold resting in her lap. She had not lit a candle. She didn't want her window glowing like a signal to anyone outside. Her ears strained for the smallest noise. Every creak of the wooden floorboards, every gust of wind against the shutters made her fingers tighten on the pouch. She thought again of the man in the black coat and the way he had moved. Deliberate, patient. He was not a drunkard stumbling after her for fun. He was a man with a purpose. By the time the lodging house fell silent, she still hadn't decided where she could go. London was a maze, but for a woman like her, there were few places to hide. The knock came just past midnight. It was soft at first, almost polite. Clara didn't move. Then it came again, harder this time, followed by a low male voice. Clara Hughes. Her breath caught. Whoever it was didn't knock like a customer. He knocked like a man who knew she was there and wouldn't leave until she answered. The voice came again, steady and calm. "We need to talk." Clara stayed silent, her back pressed against the wall beside the door. "Open the door, Clara, or I'll open it for you." Her mind raced. If she called for help, the other girls might come. But that would bring Calloway, too, and Calloway had no interest in protecting her from men who might have coin. She reached under the loose floorboard, slid the pouch into the darkness, and replaced the board. Then, heart pounding, she crossed the room and unlatched the door. The man in the black coat stood there. Up close, he was even taller than she'd thought, his face lean, his jaw sharp. His eyes were dark and cold, but his voice, when he spoke, was almost gentle. "You were at the House of Velvet Shadows," he said. Clara said nothing. "You poured drinks. You heard conversations. You saw faces you shouldn't have seen." "I don't know what you're talking about," she replied, forcing her voice to stay level. His mouth twitched into something between a smile and a sneer. "That's good. Keep saying that. Because if you don't..." He stepped inside without waiting for permission. His coat brushed against her arm, and she caught the faint smell of leather and tobacco. "There are men," he continued, "who pay dearly to ensure their names are never spoken in certain company. If they think you might talk, you won't have to worry about rent or food ever again." The unspoken meaning landed heavy in the air. "I didn't say anything," Clara whispered. "Let's make sure it stays that way." He pulled a small envelope from inside his coat and set it on the table. The weight of it made the wood creak. More money. "This is for you. It's more than most people in this neighborhood will see in a year. Take it. Leave London. Go somewhere far from here." Clara stared at the envelope. She thought of her mother's sewing table, of the warmth of the bakery oven, of the quiet dreams she once had. Leaving could mean safety. It could also mean starting over with nothing but fear in her bones. "And if I don't?" she asked. The man's expression didn't change. "Then someone else will decide for you, and it won't be as generous." He turned toward the door, then paused. "One last thing, Clara. The man with the silver-tipped cane, forget his face. Forget his name. If you remember either, you're already dead." When he was gone, the room seemed smaller, the air colder. Clara sank to the floor, her hands shaking. The gold under the floorboard and the envelope on the table were both promises and threats. And now she knew she had only two choices: disappear or fight. For the first time in years, she felt something flicker in her chest. Not just fear, but defiance. If these men thought she would vanish quietly, they had forgotten something important about women like her. She had already survived the streets of London, and she was not done surviving yet. The last gamble. For the rest of the night, Clara didn't sleep. She sat at her small table, staring at the envelope the man in the black coat had left, and listening to the lodging house groan and settle in the damp. Her mind spun in circles. Run, stay, hide, fight, each thought chasing the other without rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the men at the House of Velvet Shadows, their faces lit by candlelight, their voices speaking of things that could ruin lives. She saw the silver-tipped cane tapping lightly against the table. She saw the black coat disappearing into the fog. By the time the first light of morning seeped through the cracked window, she had made her decision. Running might keep her alive, but it would also leave her looking over her shoulder forever. Fighting might kill her, but it was the only way to end this on her terms. She dressed in her plainest clothes and pulled her shawl tight around her shoulders. The gold from the House of Velvet Shadows stayed under the floorboard. She would not carry that weight in public. Instead, she slipped the envelope into her pocket. If they wanted her gone so badly, then she would make their payment work for her. Her first stop was not the market or the train station, but a quiet tea house on the edge of Bishopsgate. It was a place she had gone once before with Bess, long ago, when they'd managed to scrape together enough for a pot of weak tea and a single scone to share. But it was not tea she came for now. She came for the woman who ran the place. Mrs. Delaney, a sharp-eyed widow who, according to whispers, had friends in the police who didn't wear their loyalty on their sleeves. Mrs. Delaney listened without interrupting as Clara told her everything. The House of Velvet Shadows, the men, the silver-tipped cane, the man in the black coat. She didn't embellish and she didn't cry. When she was done, Mrs. Delaney poured 2 cups of tea and slid one toward her. "You've got yourself in the middle of something filthy, girl," she said finally. "Filthy enough to choke this city." "I know," Clara replied. "That's why I'm not walking away?" Mrs. Delaney studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right. But if you're going to do this, you don't do it alone." Over the next 2 days, Clara followed Mrs. Delaney's instructions to the letter. She stayed in crowded streets during daylight, never taking the same route twice. She visited 2 more people Mrs. Delaney trusted, a printer who owed her a favor and a former constable with a limp. The printer gave Clara something small but powerful, a set of hastily made pamphlets, each one naming the men she'd seen that night, along with their political titles and business ties. The constable promised that if anything happened to her, those pamphlets would be scattered across London by morning. The trap was simple. If the men tried to silence her, their secrets would spill into the streets. On the third night, the black-coated man returned. He knocked once, then stepped inside without waiting for her answer. "You haven't left," he said, closing the door behind him. "No," Clara replied. "And I won't." His eyes narrowed. "Then you've made a mistake." "Maybe," she said, her voice steady. "Or maybe you have." She told him in calm, measured words about the pamphlets, about how names travel faster than money in this city, about how all it would take was one day without her appearing in public for those papers to find their way into the hands of journalists and rivals. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of wind at the window. Then he smiled, a slow, humorless smile. "Clever girl." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You've just bought yourself time. But time runs out, Clara. Always." With that, he turned and left, the echo of his boots fading down the stairs. She didn't. Fool herself into thinking she'd won. Men like him didn't forgive and they didn't forget. But she had shifted the balance, if only a little. That night she lay awake and thought of her mother's sewing table again, of seams pulled tight to keep fabric from fraying. She had stitched herself into something dangerous, yes, but also something strong. Outside, the city moved on as it always did. The fog would come back, the streets would fill with secrets, and the House of Velvet Shadows would continue to open its doors to men who believed they could buy silence forever. But now one woman in Whitechapel knew how to make that silence very, very expensive, and she intended to keep it that way.